o'clock. So I hope you guys can jump in with us right now. If not, listen later. But we're going to begin a conversation today that's going to probably take a few weeks. It is a massive conversation. We could probably spend a few years on it. In fact, a few of us have spent the last 4 years in many forms having this conversation through a graduate program. But what we want to do today is to frame up a conversation about justice and the concepts of biblical justice versus the world's concept of justice, and try to look at that through a few different angles, and some just maybe personal opinions today and thoughts, and we'll continue to build out over the next couple of weeks as we talk. A really good reference point for today, and part of why we're doing this, is an article by Tim Keller that's called A Biblical Critique of Secular Justice and Critical Theory. And so this is one of those fun articles where you're reminded that Dr. Keller is a PhD scholar, and that he's a pastor and a preacher, but he's also a scholar, and he just does a really brilliant job of outlining a lot of different points of view. You don't necessarily have to agree with his takes, but as far as a framework for this conversation, it's really helpful. And so, so let's take just a second and get a pulse from everybody that's on the call, of just the idea when we talk about biblical justice versus the world's idea of justice. What are the things that come to mind when we just prop up something like that?
I think for me, one of the first things that comes up as far as biblically, what I've grown up knowing or believing was that justice seems to be, for me, primarily pointed at the poor, those who are maybe marginalized or oppressed, that justice is something that people in that status or in those situations need. So whether that's God bringing justice or like the people of God supposed to be bringing justice, but it's very much a mandate that that as people who love God, we're supposed to essentially represent and fight for people who are oppressed or in some sort of impoverished state. So it's kind of what I grew up knowing, not really having a ton of examples to like really live into that, just because of my family's kind of, I guess, socioeconomic status growing up. So that became more real for me, probably in my 20s, was like actually trying to do justice, as Micah talks about. So anyway, that's my take.
Yeah, I think along similar lines, just reminded of the Magnificat and Mary's prayer, just talking about just the upside down kingdom coming in, where the lowly will be raised up and the prideful will be brought low, and just kind of the hierarchical and oppressive structures will be turned on their head by Jesus and by the church. And so I think that for me has stood out to me, and even just Jesus' ministry, of how he approached the people that society deems as less than or not deserving, that he intentionally goes and pursues, and gives them life and hope.
Yeah, I think I like both of those sort of parts of biblical justice. I really have always the way that the Bible really points to how we're all equal and we should treat everyone equally and care for others the same as we care for ourselves. Certainly, it's a thing that Jesus modeled, even to the point of being sacrificial. So caring for others through giving of yourself, through through treating others equally or even better. This language of how I see justice by how I treat others with equity and dignity. I think that's a aspect of biblical justice I know is really driven into me. That it was about how we care for others, for sure.
Yeah, I echo all that, and I feel like humility is a huge part of it. Being able to just come underneath those who are in need to see that. I love how you use the word dignity, Kyle. I think that's like really huge, and it's very difficult to do because I love myself a lot and I put myself in that place. So yeah, just seeing the example that Jesus gave in the New Testament as a new Christian in 7th grade, that I stayed in the New Testament because the Old Testament freaked me out. And I came from a Catholic background, so I didn't really have that base. So the New Testament was just a showing me how I'm supposed to love people and take care of others. And so just Jesus' example of the justice didn't make sense, but somehow it did make sense. I don't know if that makes sense. So yeah, just seeing his example and knowing that it's counter to my natural response or reaction.
I think my initial conversations around justice were probably, would go way back early into school, and they were really around like law and order. I think probably is where I sort of initially framed up the concept of justice, was that like there's a right way to live and be and a wrong way to live and be, and that, justice is something about getting people that are doing the wrong thing to do the right thing, or something along those lines. I'm not saying that's where I'm living today, but I think that's kind of where I started. And then I think in my kind of late 20s, being introduced to human trafficking and coming around this injustice in the world that was so horrific, it again got me thinking that, justice is the absence of human trafficking. I read a book by an author named Gary Haugen called The Good News About Injustice. And the premise of that book is that the good news about injustice is that God hates injustice. And so his mission in the world is to end that. And so, but I think it was probably like really pretty hyper focused around like really bad people doing really bad things. And it's only been in the last 8 to 10 years to pull back and to look at some of what even you guys are talking about, of like what I would say is more like systemic problems that, there's an overall injustice in the world. And so one of the quotes that we've, I think, referenced on here, and it's a quote that we've looked at several times by Lesslie Newbigin, is it's that when the church tries to embody the rule of God in the forms of earthly power, it may achieve that power, but it's no longer a sign of the kingdom. So I think what Newman is trying to get at here is that there's a journey towards justice, but the biblical journey towards justice looks really different maybe than an earthly journey towards justice. That they're sort of two different ideas, and that the church can try to play by the rule book of the world and potentially even be successful, but at the end of it, it won't end up being a sign of the kingdom of heaven breaking in. It will be something else, something that feels religious, feels strangely secular and familiar, in a bad way, but it won't look like the kingdom breaking in. So what are some thoughts on that? I know that's kind of a bit of a grenade, but just what are some thoughts that you guys have on that?
Yeah, I've got some thoughts, but I think some big ones are, the church trying to coercively conform people and culture to its ideals, whether they're true or not. It kind of makes me think about, evangelism being sort of a fear and control tactic to get, yes, we want people to believe Jesus is Lord. So that's the end result. But I think the paths to get there are, there's a lot of them. And I would argue that if if people are coming to faith because they're terrified of hell, or terrified of what could happen to them, and that's the only reason, then I would argue that's not like a great reason. That can certainly be one of them, but I think the primary reason for faith in Christ is just what's happening in a supernatural realm of this war going on between the two kingdoms, God's kingdom and Satan's, and also just our renewal in the process, and then hoping to see that renewal in the here and now as we wait for Christ's return. So a much more hopeful foundation for faith in Christ, as opposed to one of terror. And so I think, again, it's the same result of someone having faith in Christ, but it's the way that we choose to get there. I would argue one is a sign of the kingdom and the way that Jesus evangelized, if you will, and then one is maybe a sign of the world, and usually it's like, which way is easier, and it's probably not the way of God. Is sometimes a gauge that Paul used.
Yeah, I think Dr. David Fitch in particular might hear me say this and accuse me of being a little more Kelleran. I don't know if that's a phrase, of what kind of what.
Maybe?
Yeah, Niebuhrian, quite possibly. One thing that Keller says in an article that we've all kind of looked at in this discussion is, he kind of lays out. He doesn't say it like explicitly, but he says essentially that use of power is something that needs to be considered. And I think what Fitch writes is that and more of the Reformed tradition, or like a even Calvinist tradition, would say that power is okay. It's just how you use power that's important and that needs to be thought through. And I think I agree with a lot of that. That I would say that power is a thing and it needs to be used well. And I think what we see Fitch saying, and then there's also clearly evidence in the scriptures for the fact that Jesus in this idea of kenosis, like actually emptying himself and taking the form of a servant, that he actually like in those moments like puts his power to the side in a way, as far as being fully God. He's fully God still, but he doesn't exercise all of that in those moments. And so I don't know, I kind of see this play of then Jesus uses his power to heal, right? So there's this usage of power that I think is really, really interesting, and that really plays into this topic in a big way, because power over, clearly I would say is wrong, is not a biblical kingdom posture. Power under, in that sense of describing power, is clearly what I think Jesus embodies. At the same time, what do you do with the power that you find yourself, having or containing, like within your own hands? And so I think that's the big part for me that I wrestle with in this question of power. Is power just inherently bad, or is there something that we need to be doing with the power, whether it's a political power, a socioeconomic power, a social power, whatever it may be? Is there a way to flip that towards the kingdom that's good as far as usage?
Yeah, Chris, I agree with a lot of that. I think it's certainly interesting that there's in that example you gave, Jesus, pretty good example. The injustice of the day was that the Jewish people are under Roman oppression, and they were being mistreated. They had some freedoms, but there also was this oppression, and what they had hoped for a Messiah to be would be someone to free them from that oppression directly, right? So their view was Jesus should come in power, and with his power, he should overthrow an evil, oppressive regime in order to free the Israelites, free the Jewish people from their oppression. And that's what people expected Jesus to do. But he emptied himself of his power, like you said, Chris, and instead he used it to heal, and he used it to preach the message of the kingdom. And then he used it to subversively, under his power, allow himself to be killed and then come a raise in power to show that he defeated them in a whole different sort of way. So it's such an interesting, like, when we look at an injustice, is what way do we emulate Jesus in using that power? How is it that we decide that we should lay it down in a way that subverts the system? Because really, and this is some stuff that Keller mentions also, is that it tends to be this like this cycle of violence in a way of power. So if it is an oppressive system, you say, well, we need to take that system, we should overthrow it. And once we overthrow that system, we put a good system. How are we to keep that system from then becoming an oppressive system? And then there's another underneath that it has to be overthrown again and over and over and over. And it just, that cycle continues to go on. Whereas I believe that, especially in Jesus, the biblical way that Jesus attacks injustice is through the power under of his love. And that is how that's practically works and day in and day out is a difficult thing to discern. And I think that's what a work of the church is right now, is how do we discern we shouldn't be, what's happened, I'm going long, but is that we like, the church tries to gain power in order to do something good. And that's the thing that's very Niebuhrian, Chris, that I think that we have to find a way to say, we have power, how do we use it? And usually how do we use it in a way that is not by forcing and coercing, but how do we use it as a way of serving and caring for others?
Yeah. Des, any thoughts you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I think when I was reading this this morning, it seems like the way of Jesus and okay, so like Fitch and Keller are just way up here. You guys have to, like, I read it a couple times, but it seems like they're trying to highlight, or at least from Fitch's article, I feel like he's trying to highlight like the way that we should mimic Jesus, right? Like, and the fact that critical race theory should be used to help us to expose and bring light to the injustices. I feel like in a lot of these ways, if the church is following Jesus's way, and if we're following like having power under and not over, we tend to look weak, and we tend to look like we're standing still and wading in the water. And I just wonder like how embedded that is in our culture to believe that we have to act and do something versus like collectively praying and giving grace and extending like mercy to each other and realizing that we are doing something even though it looks like we're not. And that actually listening, I feel like you've said this a lot in this season, Scott, like we need to listen. And I just wonder in our culture how embedded it is for us to move and act and speak and take, you know what I'm saying? We're the power over, you know what I mean? And I think we're being called out of that to be the under. And I just don't know, like, I don't know, as I was reading it, my heart was heavy because it's like, how do we transfer this? Because we all struggle with it, right? Like it's part of us. So I don't know, that's my kind of like my questioning thoughts is like, how does this look in our lives? How do we adjust?
Yeah, this is a great question. My mind goes back to just really ancient history on this stuff. And I like to play out a scenario in my head where, so 337 AD is when Constantine dies. And about a decade, maybe 15 years before that, there's a person has a vision and conveys the vision to Constantine. And it's essentially a vision that like the God of the cross is going to be the one that like expands your kingdom and makes you even more powerful. And so along about that time, I mean, this is a very short version of the story. You should read more. It's really fascinating. But around that time, Constantine makes Christianity legal. He doesn't convert to Christianity until he's on his deathbed, but he makes it legal. And I often like to play out the scenario where Constantine like brings in some bishops into his like whatever, throne room or whatever. And like they're thinking maybe like they're gonna die because they'd been a persecuted people for hundreds of years. And Constantine is like, okay, I got great news. Christianity is not going to be illegal anymore, and it's gonna propel me to power. And I just kind of wonder what was going through the bishops' heads if they're standing there going, "Sweet, we finally made it. Now we have the power of the state to make our thing happen," or if they were mourning it, thinking, "Oh no, like now we have the power of the state." And so it's hard to, I mean, there's a lot of different accounts and stories you read about that, but it would seem in that moment that if you're a church leader, Constantine blessing your movement would be good. Because in that moment, what you would think is, oh, I now have all the worldly power I need to make what I believe happen. And that's a beginning of a bizarre set of dominoes that's been falling for 1700 years of like, the Crusades, I mean, even early, even right after this, as soon as the emperor said everybody's a Christian, then what happens is everybody who owns slaves and has households then says we're all Christians now, and that's a really bizarre change from what would have been in the early church catechesis. It would have been training and discipleship in the ways of Jesus to become a follower of Jesus, which would have been to become to live in the way of Jesus would have been to live in that way of kenosis, of emptying and sacrificial life. And all of a sudden things start to shift. And so my wife and I are watching the BBC TV show, The Musketeers right now, which is like yet another retelling of Alexander Dumas's awesome books, and watching the way the cardinal controls France. It's such a great picture of this. The cardinal is a man of God manipulating earthly power to supposedly gain some kind of end that's going to be good, allegedly. There's another grenade. All right. So what do you guys think about what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's like we're wading in so many waters here all at the same time. We discussed this, everyone, before we started. We said we got to be careful because this could take us like hours and hours. And I think the plan for this is this to be an ongoing discussion where we'll go more in depth on some of these kind of theories and thoughts. So if you've not read the Keller article, maybe you won't ever. It's a long article, so I still encourage you to. But if you haven't, essentially what he does is there's such a thing as biblical justice. Here's what biblical justice looks like according to Scripture. And some of those things that we mentioned at the beginning are sort of part of that. And then he mentioned there are some classical views of justice throughout the history of the world. Just a quick outline, that would be, what were they? They were, first was first was actually libertarian, and then there was liberal, there was utilitarian, there was postmodern. So as there has been philosophical thoughts over what justice and how justice is derived in the history of the world. And what Des mentioned earlier, critical race theory is a postmodern justice theory that's mainly about power. And it is a hot button topic in the church right now. And originally we were going to talk about critical race theory to start off with, and we realized we have to back up a while before we can get there. And that's the thing we want to get to. We want to talk about that. We want to get to all of these sort of topics, but we felt it was important to talk about just biblical justice in general, and also the way that justice is lived out in the world. Not just like, what do we believe is the right way in just way, but how does it actually work out? Because this is a thing that Scott was a little bit pointing out with the Constantine thing. This is the thing that Fitch talks about all the time, is that with the advent of Constantine on the throne, that became what he calls, a lot of people call Christendom, where Christianity was the power dominant structure. But that if you look at a lot of the world at this point, even in the last 50 years or so, Christendom is not in power, especially like in Europe, in like he always says Canada, because who we really count Canada. Sorry, Vitch, but But in a lot of the northern U.S., that's also the case too. I would say here in San Antonio, we may not quite be there, but essentially to a spot where the church has less a place of power than it once had. So how do we live in the world, especially when a biblical view of justice is not the view of justice that those in the world have? And how do we interact with that?
Yeah. Like Kyle said, we're going to try to keep this to a shorter conversation and a multi-part conversation, but let's just go around and grab some thoughts. Mike, Chris, Des, and then we can wrap up for today, and we'll keep going future weeks.
Yeah, I think, obviously we've touched on a lot of different things, but I think for me, just in thinking of coercive power versus power under, Mare and I have some strong-willed children, and what we have learned are called power struggles. And we can win those through coercive power, but what that produces in our kids is resistance, defiance, disobedience, anger, and we can get them to do the task using that power, which I think is what we've talked about. It is effective, and I think a lot of us were raised in that way of my way or the highway, and you just kind of accepted that, and but at the same time, that doesn't achieve what we want with our kids, what we should want as the church, with our culture, with our neighbors, which is a deep relationship of mutual love and respect. And that doesn't mean that me and Mare aren't authority in our kids' lives, just like it doesn't mean that God and Scripture aren't authority in the believer's life. But I think when you come alongside, we've used a lot of under language, and I think that's 100% true. One of the ways that I like to think about power under is coming alongside. It's not standing over someone, directing, or and using things that are outside of the fruit of the Spirit. It's love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. Those are all things that are used to come alongside people. And I think as we look at the life of Christ, again, he wasn't lording over, speaking over, really just to the religious elite, which is us on this call. And he's coming alongside, and then he sends the Spirit to do the same with us and empower us to live that out. So I think that, to me, is a takeaway. Are we coercively coming over people, or are we coming alongside, listening, empathy, love, and hopefully revealing truth through mutual love and relationship?
Yeah, power is seductive. I mean, once you have it, you don't want to let it go. And I think if I will recognize that in myself, and I think that's kind of the first step of this journey of at least opening up that space to understand kind of what has formed us, or what the structures are that are around us that are impacting us. I think the talk about Constantine and Christendom, and now being somewhat in a post-Christendom situation right now, I think it's a big ask of the church in general, especially where Christendom is still very heavily kind of the norm, is for pastors and church leadership to actively engage. What does it mean to not coercively live in our city and in our neighborhoods? Are we trying to get people to do our thing, kind of like Mike, your example with your kids, versus is there a way that our words and our ways reflect Jesus that's so attractive, that is so compelling, that people enter the kingdom not out of coercion, but out of truly the love of the Father calling his children home, and I think that's the real beauty and the opportunity. I don't know if we have to go to post Christendom to get there, but if we're in Christendom, I think that's there's an active step we can take. Post Christendom, you kind of don't have a choice anymore. You kind of have to do it. It's like you've already had your hand called. But I think here in South Texas, maybe we're still in that highly Christendom space, and so I think we have a chance to actively pursue this. And I think that's the hopeful hopeful journey I see for us and other churches is to engage it without being forced to, so.
I feel like I can't stop thinking about how our church has guided me by their actions, the park in particular, like how we have decided to come into a neighborhood and just basically set a table and say, we want to join you in whatever you need and how to help you. I think that's a really great example of the kingdom coming to earth. And in that way, creating relationships to develop a conversation where we can hopefully discuss Jesus, openly, or like, you know what I'm saying? Like in that relationship. So I feel like that's a great example for me. And I loved how, Chris, you said like power is seductive. And I think like me in particular, I have a lot of issues with pride. So humility comes in so often for me that it's just so necessary to have a spirit of humility and to continue to repent and admit the sin openly, you know what I mean, to ask others to help keep me in check or pray for me. But also just this example of our church coming in and saying like, here's what I have. And so that kind of has influenced me and overflown into like wanting to create tables for people, and in particular like little preteen girls, which I fought Jesus on. I did not want to do that, serving them. But I think that's the kingdom, is like coming in, setting a table and offering my time and my energy for others to build relationships with, to hear them. And so I think that's like, I don't know, to me, that's an example of coming with power under service and humility.
Yeah, and I know we'll get to more of this later. We don't want to go way too far into all this, but there's some like aspects of power we really have to consider. Like, as we're talking justice, we're saying we believe we see some injustices going on in the world right now. Very, very much so right now. We see the issues with race in America, and it is definitely a difficult topic to wade into and work through. And we're trying to find the best ways to discern and do that faithfully. And that there very well might be an instance that we need to be led to do something with our power, to change something, to fix some system of injustice. That might be a thing. But how do we do that? Do we do that through coercion and violence, or do we try and find a way to do that in a way that looks like Jesus, that brings people along? And that's really difficult. That's we don't want to look like we're doing nothing. We want to be doing something. We also don't want to do something where we're just forcing our way in and changing things thinking we know the best way. And so I think that's sort of what we're trying to wade into together, is that we really care about justice. But first of all, how do we define that? And then how do we enact that justice? That's what we're really discussing. And today we talked a little bit about the definition and a little bit about how we enact it. And I think we're going to get into this more. We'll try and get this kind of pared down every once in a while. There's some things that are, like we said, hot button issues we really want to speak to because we feel like they're important for us as a church to kind of wrestle with together. And we'd love any questions you have regarding these items. You can email us at questions@theparksa.org, and we would love to answer them. And we ask for humility and graciousness because we're working through this. I know these are banners, right? So these are banners that people put like good or bad, that if you are this, if you follow this thing, that means you're obviously on the other side. And we want to avoid that. We want to say we are followers of Jesus, and we're not trying to demonize or speak of the other as bad. But what we're trying to do is follow Jesus in a loving and kind way. And we're going to do our best to do that. So if, in your responses, understand, approach it with humility, and we will do the same. That's what we want it to be. We want it to be a conversation in how we can best love our church and love our community and love our neighbor, and do it in a way that brings justice to those who need it without demonizing other people. So hopefully that wraps up a little bit what we're doing. We only have a little bit of time in this, and I'm sure you don't want to watch for like an hour and a half, all of us just babble on about what our thoughts are on these. I highly recommend you read those 2 articles. They're pretty long. It took me like 35 minutes to read through the 2 of them. So You could read one and read another, maybe read it again and again to try and get what they're talking about. And we'll try and talk more about it later. We look forward to it. We'll see you Sunday morning. You can register to come to the service. First time this week. All of you excited? People in a room? And there's masks, there's distancing. We've got all that kind of rules on our website. You'll see it on the front page. I'd love for you to see you this weekend. Or if you're not able to come, you can watch the live stream on Facebook, YouTube, or on our website, theparksa.org. And that will be it. I'll see you guys later.